Okay, we are good to go tonight. 3 John is where we're starting this evening. I've got circled verse number 10, but we're going to back up to verse 9 in our reading to catch us up to where we want to be this evening. The book of 3 John, or the letter of 3 John, is very short. And as we've been saying now for a couple of weeks, it centers around what three prominent men are mentioned in 3 John. Gaius, verses 1 to 8. Diotrephes, verses 9 through 11. And then Demetrius, rounding out the book, verses 12 through 14. That's how we've chosen to outline the book. The encouragement of Gaius, verses 1 through 8. And now the criticism of Diotrephes, verses 9 through 11. And so, Adam, to get us started this evening, just go back to verse 9 and read down through verse 11, please.
I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, receives us not. Wherefore, if I come, I will remember his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content therewith. Neither does he himself receive the brethren, and forbids them that would, and casts them out of the church. Beloved, follow not that which is evil, but that which is good. He that doeth good is of God, but he that doeth evil hath not seen God.
Okay, back to verse 9, just a couple of comments. John says, I wrote to the church. But there is a but there. We don't know the letter that John wrote. Some say 2 John, but I don't know that there's evidence for that. Maybe another letter simply not included in the canon of Scripture. But Diotrephes, and his number one issue was what? Pride. He loved to have the preeminence. He wanted to be first place. He wanted to be noticed. He was, as we've said, power hungry. And that all goes back, of course, to pride. As we looked last week, preeminence belongs to whom? God, the Lord, right? Christ. Colossians chapter 1 and verse 18. And so this is a problem, an issue that some people, we all have our own weaknesses, and some people have a weakness when it comes to pride. That was the downfall of the devil, 1 Timothy 3 and verse 6. And as we also pointed out last week, it's not necessarily limited to the males of the species. Women can have a problem, just as much a problem at times as men. And so why the church did not deal with Diotrephes, we don't know, we're not told, but John is about to. Now they should have. For whatever reason, sometimes it's easier just to give in to some people to keep the peace, but you're just asking for trouble later on down the road. And so Diotrephes receiveth us not, and the us would include John. What position does John hold? He's an apostle of God. So when John speaks, you best listen, especially when John speaks of inspiration. That's what he's doing, obviously, in this letter. And so Diotrephes has the gall to stand up against apostolic authority, which in essence was tantamount to standing up to God himself. Since God inspired John, and rejecting John in essence is the same as rejecting God. So again, this is a real problem that John is addressing now in this letter. We don't know whether or not Diotrephes was a member of the same congregation as Gaius. And probably not, because why would John remind Gaius of somebody and something that, he already knew about? So he no doubt was in the same area. I don't know that he would have been a member of the same congregation, but in other words, this is an issue and a person that needs to be dealt with. Now picking up in verse 10, where we want to begin tonight in our study. Wherefore, if I come. John's plans are to come. In fact, verse 14 tells us he wants to be there when? Shortly. That's his plans, of course, all according to God's will, but we don't know why he's not leaving right at the moment. Evidently, there were other pressing matters, but I'm going to deal with this situation when I get there, basically is what John is about to say. If I come, I will remember his deeds which he does. That is present tense, continual action. This is something that Diotrephes is doing over and over again, repeatedly. Now, what he is doing is prating against us with malicious words. Anybody here done any prating today? Prating, prating? You know, if I don't know what the word prating means, I might have been guilty of doing some prating today. Anybody got a different rendering of the word prating? I'm using the King James, by the way. Slander, bad language, talking nonsense. This is a sin of speech, in other words. It can be translated to babble, to accuse falsely. It can be translated gossip. I'm told the word in the original was descriptive for bubbles that appear momentarily and then disappear. As kids, we all received one of those little bottles that had the little ring in there, and you pull it out and blew bubbles, right? And you try to chase those things and catch those things, and they popped and there was nothing there. So that's the idea behind the speech of Diotrephes. His words were empty. They were meaningless. Didn't mean they didn't hurt, but they were wicked words that simply were not the truth. And again, notice that he is using this evil speech against us, including John. And again, you would have to have an awful lot of gall to do this against an apostle of God. And so this evil speech, he was wrong for this kind of speech. We all would agree with that. But think about the other side of that. What about the people who listened to his speech? For evil speech to make any headway, somebody has to say it, but somebody else has to what? Listen to it. Okay? I think sometimes I forget about that. Someone says it, and someone else listens to it. And as somebody has said, a sure way to stop gossip in its tracks is to don't listen to it. Don't listen to it. I don't want to hear that. I love you. I appreciate you. But unless you can back up what you're saying about so-and-so, I just don't want to hear it. I don't want to listen to it. And that'll stop it in its tracks, that kind of speech. So this is what Diotrephes is doing. He's using malicious words, but he's not stopped with just malicious words. Not content just to use malicious words, but neither does he himself receive the brethren. Again, we're talking about missionaries here that were going from church to church and from place to place trying to build up the church and the kingdom and spread the gospel. We pointed out that Gaius was such a hospitable man and welcomed them into his home and helped them along the way. And as he was hospitable to them, he was hospitable to the gospel, and thus that helped the spread of the truth. Here's a man doing the exact opposite. He's not receiving the brethren, these traveling missionaries. He's not giving them food and shelter. He's hindering the progress that God's word could otherwise make. And not only that, he forbids those who do help these traveling missionaries, which means he would be, if Gaius were a member of the congregation, he would be opposed to Gaius for helping these who were spreading the gospel. He's saying, I don't want you helping anybody spread the truth. And the last straw was what? He cast them out of the church. For those who went ahead and were hospitable to these good men who were spreading the truth, and they were not listening to Diotrephes, somehow, we don't have all the particulars of any of this, but somehow he had gained a position in the congregation where he felt like he was in charge. And if you didn't listen to him, he would throw you out of the church. Whether that was disfellowship, or some other tactic that he used. You either side with me or hit the road, in other words. That's the kind of man Diotrephes was. Now we know the New Testament teaches that church discipline is scriptural and vital, but it is not a weapon for somebody like this dictator to use to protect himself. He was misusing a God-given command. Now, what exactly John would do when he gets there, again, there's just a question mark. What exactly John would do. We know, obviously, John would expose Diotrephes for what he was, and no doubt he would do that before the church. And I guess you sort of wonder if this wouldn't come to blows. I mean, this fellow's in such a position, anybody that opposes him, we don't exactly know what happened. I'm sure that John would have approached Diotrephes in the spirit of love, telling him to repent. Look to yourself. He would warn the others, and somehow he would divest him from the authority at least he thought he had. Somehow, whether he used miraculous powers or whatever, John would deal with Diotrephes when he gets there. And again, the church ought to have already dealt with this bully, but I guess sometimes we hope problems will just what? Go away. I'm guilty. I'm guilty of that. You just hope problems will go away. You don't want to confront the situation. I've got a ton of projects to do around the house, and somehow I'm hoping they'll just fix themselves. And they just keep piling up. I wonder why. Well, they're not going to fix themselves. Somebody's going to have to tackle that. But what's worse, of course, is when it comes to people, when it comes to the church, those situations, you want to give people time, obviously. You want to give people space. You want to be patient. But again, there comes a time when situations and people have to be dealt with. If I have cancer and I hope that my cancer will cure itself, that 9 times out of 10 is a policy of disaster. It just is not going to happen.
You almost wonder how much the congregation knew about John's communication with Diotrephes, because if when you notice verse 9, you almost get the feeling that John wrote to the church, but Diotrephes basically interrupt that line of communication. So you almost wonder if maybe the people aren't aware of how serious the problem is, because perhaps what Diotrephes is doing, if he's talking nonsense, is basically, rejecting these messengers that are coming, but at the same time, maybe making the statement that John would agree with what I'm saying. So if John comes in person, he can just cut out Diotrephes and get the message right to the congregation, which perhaps Diotrephes is, for his own selfish reasons, is trying to portray things to be different.
Right. The people could have been in the dark, in other words. They could have been totally in the dark. You're exactly right. But they won't be when John gets there. They won't be, and he'll deal with the situation. Keep in mind, of course, we're talking about the first century where they did not have a completed Bible then. And so they were at the mercy of inspired men. And John says, I'll set the record straight when I come. And so as a follow-up to all of that is verse 11. Beloved, he's not talking about Diotrephes there, right? Who's he writing to? Gaius or Gaius. Beloved, follow not that which is evil. And in my mind, he's talking about the practice of Diotrephes specifically. Obviously, you're not supposed to follow anything that is evil. But in the context, I'm sure he's referencing Diotrephes. Don't follow that man. Don't mimic. The word follow can be translated mimic or imitate. And don't follow evil, but follow that which is good. He that doeth good is of God. And that would not include Diotrephes. That would include Gaius and Demetrius. But he that doeth evil hath not seen God. And that would be indicative of this Diotrephes individual. Is it right to imitate a man? as long as that man is a follower of God. It's right to follow a man as long as a man's following God. Paul said, be followers of me. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 1, of course. And Paul was one who followed God. Your thoughts on Diotrephes? Gaius, a good man. John encouraged him, verses 1 to 8. Diotrephes wasn't, and he was soundly rebuked and would be at John's arrival, verses 9 through 11.
You know, some of these, you think back to the 2nd John, you know that is a difficult issue at the time, is trying to figure out who's a true teacher of the gospel and who's a false teacher of the gospel. And the last thing that you need in this case is a situation in which good teachers of the gospel are discouraged because of men like Diotrephes.
Right.
And so I think the 2nd John, 3rd John kind of tie in together, because Diotrephes is a serious problem, not just because of his own pride, not just because of his own church, but the effect that it has on these people going around preaching the gospel. Right.
Be easy to get discouraged, wouldn't it? Somebody slams the door in your face who himself is a supposed Christian and not helping out. That's exactly right. Well, we have 3 verses, and so let's now round out talking about Demetrius. And Adam, if you will, just read verses 12 to 14.
Demetrius hath good report of all men and of the truth itself, yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. I had many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to thee. Our friends salute thee. Greet the friends by name.
We don't know a whole lot about this fellow by the name of Demetrius. We know that his name is the same name as the Greek corn goddess. The Greek corn goddess also had the name Demetrius. And we don't want to assume that this Demetrius was a follower of some type of goddess. We know that many in the early church had names they were given that were associated with paganism back there, but that didn't mean that they supported paganism. Silas, his name Silvanus, was a Roman god of the woods. Sylvan, you've heard the word Sylvan. The woman's name Diana has its origin in a Roman goddess with the same name. That doesn't mean that women today who are called Diana believe in a Roman goddess. Anymore, when we use the names of the days of the week, those all names were coined, again, in honor of pagan gods or paganism. Well, when I say Monday, I don't connect that with paganism or Wednesday or anything like that, but the origin of the names were. So don't, just because the name Demetrius had its origin in the Greek corn goddess, that doesn't mean that he worshiped the Greek corn goddess. Now let's look back to Acts, the 19th chapter. We do have another fellow in the Bible by name of Demetrius, so let's go back to Acts 19. What city are we in Acts, the 19th chapter? Ephesus. Well, we're not there, but Paul is, and his companions. In Acts 19, of course, Ephesus is a city, like most cities of that time, connected with idolatry. And Paul and his men, when they went from city to city, spoke against idolatry and promoted the one true God. Well, for those who were in the idol-making business, what did they think about Paul doing that? Were they happy? Hey, he's hitting our pocketbook. And that's what Acts 19 is all about. So verse 24 says, in Ephesus there was a certain man. What was his name? Demetrius, a silversmith, not a blacksmith, but a silversmith. He made silver shrines for Diana, and he brought a lot of money. No small gain means he brought a lot of gain, a lot of money unto the craftsmen. And so they caused a ruckus in Ephesus and practically a riot. And that's another story, obviously. And so the question, what is the question then? What question comes to mind? Is this the same man? The word says Demetrius of Acts 19 Was he converted? He was from Ephesus, and now he's converted, and look at what a change in his life. And our answer is, we just don't know. Just because it's tempting to think it's the same man because it's the same name. But folks, there were millions of people who lived at this time. As there are billions of people who live in our time. Do any two people of our time have the same name? Why, there are tons of Bobbies and Marys and Sues and Johns and Waynes and so forth. There were a lot of Demetriuses in that day too. So just because you've got a Demetrius in Acts 19 and now Demetrius in 3 John, that doesn't necessarily mean they were the same men. We just don't know. We would like to think, that he was the same man and he changed, but we just have to leave it at that. But this Demetrius, whoever he is a good man. In fact, the Bible says, John says, he has good report of all men, which, by the way, is one of the qualifications of an elder. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 7. Now, good report of all men can be a good thing. On the other hand, Jesus said, beware when all men speak well of you. Luke 6:26. Again, you have to consider the context. On the one hand, if everybody's patting me on the back and speaks well of me, I might not be doing my job as a Christian. I'm going to upset some people if I'm a true Christian. Jesus did. His apostles did. I'm going to have enemies if I'm a true Christian. So in that sense, beware when all men speak well of you. But in another sense, when it comes to your example, that's what John's talking about here. Demetrius has good report of all men. Now, we don't take that to mean literally every single person on the planet, correct? Would Diotrephes have spoken well of Demetrius? Highly doubtful. Would the allies of the devil speak well of Demetrius? Absolutely not. And so, generally speaking, everybody speaks well of Demetrius. That is, he's got a good what? Reputation. He's got a good reputation. He has a good name, and that's something we all want to have. We're not going to please everybody, but we do want to have a good reputation and good character, and that's something that can take a lifetime to build. How long does it take to destroy? A second. A second can destroy character and a good name and reputation. Just think of all the, quote, famous people that we've heard of in just the last several months. Famous people who have become infamous almost overnight. When I was growing up, one of my favorite football players was O.J. Simpson, Buffalo Bills. I mean, I don't worship any sports figure, but as a boy, he was a hero in my young mind. But the name O.J. Simpson, most don't connect the word hero with today. What a fall. And news broadcasters and the rich folks, some are in prison today because of a moment's indiscretion or crime and a ruined reputation. Demetrius, though, his reputation is untarnished. Good report of all men, and the truth backs it up. Now, it's great when you've got folks saying what a good man you are, but it's greater when the truth says you're a good man. Here's a fellow who has the truth living in him. And as a third bonus, who also is patting Demetrius on the back? John. We also bear record. And when you've got an apostle of God, and keep in mind, God is inspiring the man to say this and write it, so God says Demetrius is a good man. And when God says somebody's a good man, he's a good man, right? I don't care what anybody says. I don't care if the whole world says you're a bad man. If God says you're a good man, that's all that matters. what a good man Demetrius is. And you know that our record is true. And so you would like to have congregations full of Gaiuses and Demetriuses. And you don't want a single Diotrephes. So verse 13. Now when you look at verse 13 and 14, that sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Where have we heard those words before? 2 John. I just turned the page over in my Bible. It's almost identical. 2 John 12, especially verse 12, is almost identical to verses 13 and 14. And so John says, Gaius, I've got a lot more I need to write. I'd like to write you a whole lot more about other pressing matters. Well, why don't you? You'd rather be there face to face, right? Keep in mind, there's nothing like a personal visit. We talked about that in 2 John. We'd much rather talk to somebody in person. It's a lot easier to iron out issues when we look at somebody in the eye versus over the phone or social media. We've talked about that. You know, people don't think, write something, jot something hastily they ought not to have done, and then they hit send, and then you can't get it back, can you? Boy, I wish I hadn't hit the send button. Can I get it back? Oh, it's at the other person's phone. Too late. That person's upset, responds back hatefully, and you've got a war going on that might never have started had you sat down, looked each other in the eye, and just hashed some things out as friend to friend. So there's nothing like a personal visit. I had many things to write, but will not with ink and pen write unto thee. Now keep in mind, we take a lot for granted, don't we? I mean, I got a pen, you've got a pen, all God's children have a pen, right? We've got hundreds of these things. If you need a church pen, we've got a bucket full of them back there. Write and write and write all day long, reams of paper. Think of the difficulty, though, of writing in the first century. Now, I'm told, and I just have to take their word for it, quills were not actually used until about the 5th century. They weren't using quills. Well, I don't see how you could say no one did, but usually they would take maybe a piece of a stick of wood or whatever, a reed, and the ink was soot and oil. And they would mix that together. And of course, you didn't go out and buy college ruled paper. You usually used papyrus. That reed, you'd have to split that reed down the middle and then stretch it out, press it. Then you'd have to let it what? Dry. Plants are wet. You know, water goes through plants. You're not going to write on wet material. You're going to have to let that dry in the sun for some time, and then you could write on that. They would use leather sometimes, usually the papyrus, and so forth. And so John says, you know what? I'm not going to write with ink and pen write to you. Verse 14, I trust I shall shortly see thee. I don't know how long it took for John to arrive. Evidently there were other matters he had to deal with where he was. But and when I see you, we'll speak in person. If you have a different translation, such as the ESV or New American Standard Bible, anybody here have any of those? How many verses you have in 3 John? 15. ESV and New American Standard Bible have 15 verses. King James has 14 verses. But if you look, they did not leave out any words. All they did was split verse 14 into 2. Why? What's our answer? We don't know. I don't know. I guess and that's not a reflection on any translation at all. I mean, if you leave out words, then that's a reflection. But they didn't leave out any words. They just decided to split verse 14 into 2 parts. maybe thinking that the peace part of it is sort of a different thought or a fitting conclusion, but that's not a salvation issue. I just thought we'd bring that up sort of as something to notice, just something to notice. But the same thought is in all of them. I'm not going to write anymore. I'm going to see you soon. We'll talk face to face. So peace be to you. Maybe Gaius was not at peace, knowing what Diotrephes was doing. I don't know, but we'll deal with these. Our friends salute thee. There is a denomination, by the way, that refers to its members as the Friends. The Friends. And there are not many of them in the South. The Quakers. Ever heard of the Quakers? Ever eat Quaker oats? I don't know if they have anything to do with that or not. I'm told, I don't know that I've ever met a Quaker, but they are very moral people, very, very moral people. And they refer to their members as the Friends. Nothing wrong with that at all. John's talking about friends here. Our friends salute or say hello. That's what he's saying. Gaius, everybody here says, tell you hi. Gomer says, hey, sort of to say. And then greet the friends by name. By name. We like to hear our name, don't we? If it's a good thing. We like to hear our name. It's nice to know that people are praying for you and they're mentioning your name. Now, we can't mention everybody's name. Obviously, in our prayers, there's 7 billion people on the planet. By the time you got to 1 million names, you'd be exhausted. So you can't call every single person by name, but in your circle of friends and congregation, we're small enough where we can pray for one another. By name, by name. Greet the friends by name. Your thoughts on the book of 3 John, or the letter of 3 John, as we're about to transition to Jude.
Do we know where these people were? Did I miss it? Or do we know what city? We don't know.
That's another I don't know. We just do not know. We could conjecture, and some have, but the bottom line is we don't know. Somewhere in... We don't know that John, his hope is to, but whether he actually did, just simply we do not know. How many perfect churches have there been? Not one perfect church. Congregation, the people that John's addressing, they had their problems. Even in the presence of apostles of God, they had problems. So when there are people, there are problems. There are no perfect churches. I know that some people go from church to church thinking they'll find the perfect church. Well, you won't. You won't. That's one thing that stands out in my mind. Another thing that stands out in my mind, as we talked about a moment ago, you don't ignore problems. Problems don't vanish on their own. If my tooth starts hurting, well, I don't like going to the dentist. I'll tell you right now, I don't like it. But if I keep putting that toothache off, then I'm going to eventually have some real problems, won't I? I may get an infection. I'll probably lose a tooth. I may lose a number of teeth. So you don't ignore problems, especially in the church. Notice that God has chosen to take 3 men and preserve their names for all time. Gaius, Diotrephes, and Demetrius. And I have to ask myself, of those 3 men, which am I most like? And how would I like it if God had preserved my life's record for all of history to read? And what would my record reveal? You think about that, God is preserving a record of our lives, isn't he? And it's all going to come out one day. So if I'm ashamed of myself now, I need to do some straightening up so I won't be ashamed on that day. Let's look at Jude. Let's transition for a moment now to Jude. We don't have a couple of minutes left, but let's just say a few words by way of introduction. I don't have to turn the page on my Bible to get to Jude. When I leave 3 John, I'm right there at Jude. Notice that Jude is a tad bit longer, correct, than either 2 John or 3 John. How many verses in Jude? It may depend on your translation. I've got 25 in mind, so this again is not a long letter. This is another, here we go again, this is another of the one-chapter books of the Bible. How many of them are there? 5, and what are they? Obadiah? Philemon? 2nd, 3rd John? And Jude. We've talked about that for the last 3 books, so we ought to have that down pat. And as you know, whenever we start a Bible book, we ask a number of questions about the book. The first question is, who wrote the book? Who wrote the book? And that ought to be easy, right? From verse 1. Jude wrote the book. Jude. As we've often said, when they wrote letters in the first century, where did they sign their name? Right at the start. Unlike us, we wait to the very end. They signed their name right at the beginning to remove all doubt. Jude, who's his brother, by the way? Brother of James. Verse 1 says he's the brother of James. Now, we talked about Demetrius a while ago. There were several people who bore the name Demetrius, and there were several different Jameses even in the Bible. And it's easy to get all these confused. This James is not James the Apostle. This James was the one who was a prominent member of the Jerusalem church. He's the one who wrote the book of James. And this James, along with Jude, they were sons of Joseph and Mary, which would make them related how to Jesus? Half brothers. Why were they half brothers, not full brothers? Joseph wasn't father of Jesus. They had the same, all had the same mother, okay, but they were half brothers then of Christ. You can look at the list there, Matthew 13, Mark the 6th chapter. In fact, well, we're out of time for tonight. I just wanted to say a few words by way of introduction. We'll say a few more words by way of introduction next Wednesday, and then